Hello, everyone. Today I'm talking about imagery. I'm recording this lecture. This is Tuesday, the 10th. This is just before I'm making the week 8 module live. So, right now we should be in week 7. You should be just starting to finish reading the two poems here, Dulce Decorum Est and The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. But today, because I'm going to be talking about imagery, a lot of what I'm going to be covering in this lecture can be applied both to the stuff that we're reading for this week, week 7, but also to what we're going to be doing for week 8 and so on. And I really thought about doing imagery because it's one of the few things we haven't really talked about. We've talked about meter, we've talked about form, and you'll notice that week 5's poems, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night and Incident, as well as Ulysses from week 6, they were both heavy in form. You'll notice that they both relied on certain meter and rhyme schemes, although Ulysses did less rhyming, but it still relied very much on a specific meter, especially the last line, right? To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, right? It's very much iambic pentameter. But we're going to find that starting this week, in week 7, and going on to week 8, a lot of that form is going to go away because of the movement, the poetic and poetry movements that are happening at the same time. Ulysses, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, and Incident, these were all written somewhere between the Romantic, Victorian, and modern period. Dulce Decorum Est, The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, those are both written very much modern and postmodern periods, and same thing with these. And you're going to notice that there's going to be some changes. We're not going to rely so much so on form and structure, or meter for that matter. We're going to rely now on images and really what we think of as the concrete versus the abstract image. And that's what I want to talk about today. So the way I want to do this is by going through a few pieces, not too many, just 3 pieces that I really enjoy for very different reasons, and I think that highlight for us what we're looking at. If we look at, let's say, Ulysses, which we just covered last week, and I just finished grading the discussion board posts, we'll notice that there is a lot of imagery, but it's not the focus, right? We do have this idea of rust, and that Ulysses is constantly comparing himself with these things, but these things are not necessarily themselves. They are more of representations of bigger abstract ideas, right? When we think of rust, we think of something aging for a very long time that is no longer useful. If you have a knife, for instance, and it rusts, well, you can't use that knife anymore, especially, for instance, if it's like a steak knife, right? You're not going to want to put that rust in your food anymore. And so we throw it away, we discard it. But again, the poem Ulysses isn't about rust itself, like rust as a thing, right? Which is just a biological, or not biological, I'm sorry, a chemical process. Alfred Lord Tennyson uses it as a commentary for aging, right? And we just use that as a metaphor. For other poems, we're going to find that images really do mean what the image itself represents, right? A flower is just a flower. A flower doesn't necessarily have to symbolize something else like love, right? And that's what we're going to get into today, is how do we know when an image is representing itself or represents something bigger? And often this question becomes ambiguous because of the intention of the poet. The poet is often going to be playing with this idea that an image can be both itself and the thing it represents symbolically. Okay, so the first thing I want to go through, I think, is something by H.D. Hilda Doolittle. She's a fantastic poet, and she's actually the in my argument, I would argue she's probably the best example of an imagist, right? Which is part of the imagism movement. This idea that a poem ought to use concrete imagery to express its meaning, right? And then it was the audience's job or the reader's job or the listener's job to then extrapolate the information from there, right? They give us an image, the poet presents an image, and the reader or the listener uses that image to make it mean something. And in that meaning making would be where the real poetry lies. Okay, so I'm going to read you this really short poem called Evening by H.D. And I want you to pay careful attention to what she's doing with the imagery here. The light passes from ridge to ridge, from flower to flower. The hepaticas, widespread under the light, grow faint. The petals reach inward. The blue tips bend toward the bluer heart, and the flowers are lost. The cornel buds are still white, but shadows dart from the cornel roots. Black creeps from root to root. Each leaf cuts another leaf on the grass. Shadow seeks shadow. Then both leaf and leaf shadow are lost. So you notice here there's very little, I don't think any rhyme whatsoever. And even the meter doesn't match, right? There's, let's see, four syllables here, 4 syllables here, but then we have 6 syllables here, and then what it looks like 7 syllables here. So obviously, meter has nothing to do with it, and it changes almost arbitrarily. Although we can say that the line sort of begins, right? She's separating lines based on like syntactic, right? So this is like the sentence here, and then we have a prepositional phrase, another prepositional phrase, the sentence again, another prepositional phrase, and then the verb phrase, right? So she is separating them in a very grammatical way, but that's it. She allows the grammar to determine when she wants to start a new line. But otherwise, there is no other form or structural reason for separating the lines this way. Same thing with the stanza break. The stanza doesn't really seem to do anything other than the fact that she's focusing on 2 different flowers, right? Here she's talking about hepaticas, and here she's talking about cornel buds, right? That's about the only difference, right? Her determination of separating stanzas is based just on the content itself. And you'll notice then the poem is called Evening, and you'll notice that's exactly what she's describing here. She's describing what happens in the evening to the color and light that she's looking at. And she's looking at essentially 2 ridges and several flowers as the light is passing them. And she's describing in as great and poetic detail as she can that experience of evening. And it's very simple, right? But this is still really powerful because what she's doing is making a statement about what imagery really means. And she's allowing certain words to color the meaning of what she means by evening, right? She says, the flowers are lost, right? They're not literally lost, but figuratively, right? If we're familiar with the process of day and night, we know that flowers will eventually close up in the evening and bloom in the morning. And she's describing this closing up as them being lost, meaning they're lost from view or lost from sight. And again, same thing here. Again, lost, right? But she also gives personification in a few places, right? She says shadow seeks shadow, as if shadow has this human quality of seeking, that it's capable of seeking something, of actively doing it, or that it creeps. That the black, meaning the shadow here, creeps from the root to the root. Again, whether light has a consciousness of being able to creep or to seek anything is completely, I think, metaphysical, but it is still a personification, but she's still relying very much on the image to do the work here. But we could, extract some commentary from this poem simply by saying, like, okay, she's giving meaning to evening as a form of death or loss of something, in this case, light. And yet, it's a very simple idea. It's a very simple poem, but the meaning here is still very much important for us and how other poems are read. So this is a very, again, imagistic view of what poetry could be like if we take the image very literally. But sometimes what we do is we can take an image and give it meaning. And this is probably some of the poetry we are familiar with. I'm going to read from a textbook I have. It's an anthology that has more recent writers from the Beat movement. One such poet, his name is Hubert Selby Jr., and you probably won't find him in most anthologies because he's not what we'd consider, an academic poet or someone who's very familiar with forms or the craft of poetry. He's more of, I'd say, a renegade poet, but I still love his work. And at the end of one of his poems called Psalm 16, he says this. He says, "I said to the almond tree, speak to me of God, and the almond tree blossomed." And it's a very powerful, again, that's the whole, it's just 2 lines. I said to the almond tree, speak to me of God, and the almond tree blossomed. But it's very powerful because what he's doing is creating, again, an image, right, of this tree blossoming. But because of the first line about what he says to it, literally or figuratively, we don't know, but because of what he says to the tree in the first line, that image of it blossoming suddenly has new meaning, right? We can look at that second line as a manifestation of his utterance, or as the meaning of God itself, or as a sort of natural inclination to think that God is omnipresent, right? So those 2 lines have a lot of meaning in them, and it relies, again, heavily on this image of a tree blossoming, simple as that. And so poetry can have this effect, right, where we can have a very simple, imagistic poem like this one by H.D. called Evening, or we can have a really, metaphysical and heavily metaphoric poem, such as the one that by Hubert Selby Jr. But there is another, and this one is pretty risque. It's by William Wantling, and I have it here for everyone to read off. I want to zoom in a little bit so we can read it together. But I should warn you, it does have language, and it can be very powerful and very gruesome at the same time. So again, with this one, I want you to pay attention to what the author is doing. Again, the author is William Wantling. He died back in the 70s, and he was a very, very powerful poet. But what he's doing in this poem, if you pay attention, is he's making a commentary on form and structure, sort of the formalistic elements of poetry, and comparing them to the very heavy intensive imagery that you will find in more, modern poems. And see if you can find where that happens. I've got to be honest. I can make good word music and rhyme at the right times and fit words together to give people pleasure, and even sometimes take their breath away. But it always somehow turns out kind of phony. Consonants and assonance and inner rhyme won't make up for the fact that I can't figure out how to get down on paper the real or the true which we call life. Like the other day I was walking on the lower exercise yard here at San Quentin, and this cat called Turk came up to a friend of mine and said, "Ernie, I hear you're shooting on my kid." And Ernie told him, "So what, punk?" And Turk pulled out his stuff and shanked Ernie in the gut, only Ernie had a metal tray in his shirt. Turk's shank bounced right off him, and Ernie pulled his stuff out, and of course Turk didn't have a tray and caught it dead in the chest. A bad one. And the blood that came to his lips was a bright pink lung blood. And he just laid down in the grass and said, "Shit, fuck it, shit, fuck it." And he laughed a soft, long laugh, 5 minutes, then died. Now, what could consonance or assonance, or even rhyme, do with something like that? So again, I pardon the language, but you'll notice that the language is actually very powerful, because that's probably exactly what Ernie probably said just before he died. I think it was Ernie, yeah. Oh, no, Turk, sorry. Turk. what Turk must have said just before he died. And that's very powerful. And that's exactly what William Wantling is doing here, right? And he even comments it, right? He says, what could consonance, assonance, or even rhyme, which we associate, again, mostly with poetry, do with an image as powerful as the one he sees of one man trying to stab another man in his abdomen, only to be thwarted and then have his own gut pierced and stabbed and die like that, with him spitting up blood from his lungs. And so that again is a bigger commentary, I think, on the use of imagery in not just in poetry, but just in the actual canon or the tradition of what poetry ought to be like. And so this is going to happen. This happens over and over again, where certain writers refuse to bend to this idea that poems should be strictly in a specific form or a specific meter, right? When we think of that, we think of poets like Shakespeare or Christopher Marlowe or John Donne, people who stuck to a very specific rhyme scheme or a very specific form. We think also of Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. That's very much a closed form, the VNL. And we now would probably dismiss that as, anyone who writes a VNL today is clearly missing the picture, as most poets probably argue, that poetry can be much more powerful, and we have to either rely on something, how do we arrive at the truth, or how do we arrive at what's real, if all we're thinking of is the form and structure. We can also think of, and a very good example, the love song of Jail for Prufrock. It's a fantastic poem. Let's see if I can find it. Yes, by T.S. Eliot. It's a long poem, and so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I do want you to get an idea of what he's doing with imagery here. And this is, again, probably falls somewhere between, and this technically he's writing in the Victorian period. Not the Victorian period, modern period. Just, around the time of the First World War. And this is a commentary, really, about, how can I put this delicately, about sleeping around, essentially. He's seeing the world around him kind of crumble, both morally and physically. And so he starts off his poem with an epigram in Italian, and I'll let you do some research on that if you're interested about what it says. But I'm going to skip down here where he talks about women. He says, in the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. So just in this one or two stanzas, technically, he's talking about a room, and when he says that the women talking of Michelangelo, he means that, again, Michelangelo is a late Renaissance artist, and he would have been Italian Renaissance anyway, a late Italian Renaissance artist, and this would have been, over centuries later, and women are still talking about him, suggesting that these women are pseudo-intelligent, right? They're not really intelligent, they're just pretending to be, by talking about this person. But notice he talks about this yellow fog and yellow smoke, and how he's giving it certain qualities about licking its tongues into the corner of an evening. So there's obviously this really weird magical imagery happening, that he's clearly talking about sex here, right? But he's giving these sexual characteristics to something that cannot be sexual. In this case, the yellow fog, the yellow smoke. And if we're familiar, like I said with when we were talking about short stories, we were talking about imagery then. We can talk about yellow being a symbol of sickness, right? Of jaundice. And so he's talking about this sickening fog or this sickening smoke, usually from inside these houses. And if you have all these houses crammed in an urban area, it creates this fog, this smoke that covers everything. And not just that, but he's also later in the poem he references smoking cigarettes and so on. And he uses this refrain over and over again about the women coming and going, talking of Michelangelo. And he talks about knowing them in very peculiar ways, right? He says, I have known the eyes already, known them all, the eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase, and when I am formulated, sprawling on a pin, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all the butt ends of my days and ways, and how should I presume? And he goes on, and he talks about arms and so on. And he says, shall I say, I have gone at dusk through narrow streets and watched the smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves, leaning out of windows. I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. And that's a really powerful image, right? Basically that all of these men who are clearly just done with the sexual intercourse or the act of sex, and yet wondering this thought, right? That they are no better than the scum of the earth, doomed to live in loneliness and silence. And so again, what he's doing is taking images that we are all very familiar with, but that can represent something else. And it's difficult here to take his poem at face value, as just as he says it, right? Because most of us do not know what yellow fog or yellow smoke in a city look like, or what they mean or represent. And so it's upon the poet to make that image clear about what it's doing, usually in this case by giving it humanistic qualities, right? By giving it this essence of sexual intercourse or sexual characteristics. Or as HD did in her poem Evening, she's giving the shadows an attempt to be humanistic or characteristic. Same thing with the poem by by Hubert Selby Jr. About talking to the almond tree and how it blossoms, right? As if the almond tree was alive and conscious of his utterance. Or again, we can take a look on the other extreme. We can look at something by William Watling, where he dismisses these ideas, because he published this. This is the William Watling's poem. Was published more recently than the others, but it's key to note that for a long time, imagism or imagery was essentially the power of conveying most messages through poetry. But William Watling essentially deconstructs that and says that poetry by itself isn't enough. It's the utterances or the words that we use to shape that experience. That real, true experience is what gives life to poetry, not just the image that we invoke. And what he's also saying is that it's impossible to write poetry without having seen it yourself, without having seen what you're trying to write about yourself. And that's, again, T.S. Eliot was very much part of that world, of sexual immorality, of debauchery, and he spoke against it. And William Watling was very much part of that world. He was a black man living in heavily crimed areas, and he saw most of these things regularly. So I want to leave off this lecture with just a few thoughts here. You're going to be reading two war poems, Dulce de Cormest and The Death of Walter Gunner. And there is one interview with a professor from Boston University who's going to cover Dulce de Cormest and pay attention to the imagery in the interview that she mentions or that she discusses, because that imagery is going to become very powerful in Randall Jarrell's The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, and it'll become just as powerful when we read some more contemporary pieces, Traveling Through the Dark and Careful What You Ask For. Especially Careful What You Ask For, because that poem was written much more recently than any that we've read so far. And you should still be able to spot the power of imagery in poetry. As always, one of the things that I also want you to pay attention to, I have provided, again, the glossary of literary terms that I've had since early in the semester, but also the glossary of poetic terms through Poetry Foundation. And Poetry Foundation is this site, by the way. It's a fantastic site. I use it for most poems. Again, the only problem I have with this site is that it really limits itself in the kinds of poetry it publishes. It won't publish controversial or otherwise explicit poetry, which I think is really important. For instance, it has not published Howl by Allen Ginsberg, which is arguably one of the best poems written of our generation or of the previous generation, and it hasn't published Amiri Baraka's Someone Blew Up America. Those are very powerful poems in their own rights, and they haven't been published. So that's probably my only criticism of this site. But otherwise, it's a fantastic resource, not just for understanding poetry devices or the techniques, but also understanding the movements and the schools of thought that would come from poetry. But since this is an introduction course, I'm going to let you peruse that at your discretion. There's no pressure to do that anytime soon. But I do hope that you can use it as a resource when you're writing your analysis for these poems. The last thing I do want to talk about very quickly, since I just finished grading the discussion board for week 6, I believe. Yes, for week 6. I asked you to give me the theme or message from Ulysses and to write an analysis in support. I apologize for the typo of your answer. But I noticed that a lot of you sort of attempted a half analysis. So remember, analysis means to take something whole and break it down into its parts. And by studying each of those parts, you then can understand the whole better. In this case, when we're talking about poetry, it would mean breaking down a poem into its parts, its form, its structure, its meter, its rhyme, its imagery, its language, whatever the case might be. And then from those elements, we can then begin to piece together a message or theme. So many of you clearly understood the theme, which, by the way, shouldn't have been difficult to determine. If you read the poem a few times, the theme should be quite obvious. But how you arrived at the answer is what I was hoping to discover, and that's what I was looking for. A lot of you are still relying far too much on secondary sources like Wikipedia. I never once mentioned dramatic monologue. And so that's not one of the terms I'm having you become familiar with. So I know for a fact that came from Wikipedia. And some of you are relying too much on outside sources that are incorrectly analyzing the poem. So, be careful of that too. I want you to do this of your own abilities to really see if you're understanding the material. So when I ask you to write an analysis, it is so that you can attempt to make your own conclusions about the poem, right? Now, Ulysses is a very, I think, simple poem to understand. It is antiquated, old, so some of the language is difficult to understand in that respect. But for the most part, it should have been pretty simple. Even just the last 4 lines of the poem should reveal essentially the entire meaning. But keep that in mind as you go through both of these, or the next few poems. We still have several weeks left of poetry. Week 8, we're going to do 2 poems. Week 9, I think I'm going to introduce you all to Billy Collins, who's arguably one of my favorite poets. And then after that, I think we'll do 1 or 2 more poetry discussions before we move on to drama. And towards the end of the poetry unit, probably around week 10, I'll have you guys work on the literary analysis for poetry before moving on to drama. Okay. As always, if you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to email me. I do still have my phone number listed on the syllabus, so you can text me. If you need to call me for whatever reason, I would ask that you first text me to make sure I'm available for a phone call. And if so, then we can talk over the phone. But I do teach during the week, and obviously I have other responsibilities as a father, so I can't necessarily drop everything to answer your call immediately. But if you text me, I can still respond within an appropriate amount of time. All right, thank you very much.